All right, the silence is actually becoming very loud, so I'm going to begin. Welcome, both to those of you who are watching us live and to those of you who prefer to take in our events as polished recordings. I should begin with a word of thanks to Peter Hardy, Rick Finlay, Hugh Nathan, and Pete Griffiths for helping to put this together. Now let's meet our panel. Tom Bradshaw is an award-winning sports journalist and academic whose reportage has appeared in The Times, The Guardian, The Observer, and the Times Literary Supplement. He's a regular voice on BBC Radio and co-edits Ethical Space. He's the author of Literary Sports Journalism Beyond the Boundaries, published, unless I'm much mistaken, exactly 1 year and 1 day ago today. Kasey Symons is a lecturer in sports media at Deakin University and co-founder of Siren Sport. This is a collective championing the voices of women and non-binary people in sports journalism. Her work spotlights equity, fandom, and representation, and has earned her national recognition and fellowship awards. Finally, Elizabeth Ellison is Dean of Communication, Media, and Journalism at the University of Adelaide, and leads major arts and communication projects in collaboration with councils, governments, and cultural organizations. Her research in applied and regional arts has shaped public art trails, sector consultations, and innovative training programs. Professors Symons and Ellison are co-authors with Lee McGowan and Paddy Hoey of Contemporary Literary Sports Journalism, History's Futures, and the Contests in Between, published, I think, only a month ago. So let's begin. The study of literary sports journalism is, to say the very least of it, a burgeoning field. We've had two books in less than a year, I've just mentioned both of them, on a subject which had previously come in for almost no serious attention beyond broad praise and sort of flattering invitation. And what's true of literary sports journalism in particular is true of the study of literary journalism writ large. Palgrave Macmillan, publisher of all of our contributors, has launched a whole series on the subject, already populated by 6 exhaustive volumes on topics as diverse as travel writing and colonial Australia. Perhaps the panel would like to talk us through the rise of the field as opposed to the subject and explain this sudden explosion of interest. I think we should begin with Prof. Bradshaw, who authored the first of the books I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the publishing industry is a curious beast, and the preoccupations of publishers can either kind of make for an idea taking off or kill it dead. And I think all three of us who are talking today have probably benefited from publishers themselves, editors themselves, sort of taking an interest in the literary dimensions of sports writing. I think for me, I'd probably locate this to begin with in the context of how, for many decades, sports writing in particular had a sort of low professional esteem, almost sort of in the United Kingdom. I'm talking about here. That should preface it with that. Had quite a low sort of esteem within journalism itself. In various academic literature and more widely, you sometimes have phrases like sports journalists or the sports department being referred to as the toy department of the newsroom, as though sports journalism is somehow trivial, infantile almost. One thing I think, I'm talking about the UK situation here. It's very different, I think, if you look at the history of sports writing in the United States, where it didn't have a condescending, the wider journalism didn't have a condescending approach to sports writing. And in fact, sports writing was regarded as one of the, potentially one of the more literary dimensions of journalism. Right from the early 20th century, sports journalists are given lots of space to write about sport because, and whilst every country is different, I think my argument, which I've made actually in the book, is that in terms of a relatively young nation like the United States defining itself, sport was a way in which it partially did that. And I think that therefore the way in which sports journalists were able to mediate, express that sense of coming of age and what it meant to be, in some senses, an American, meant that there was, as I say, this more elevated status given to sports writing. So, we'll maybe talk about it a little later when we talk about specific cricket writers and how they maybe changed the way that sports writing was viewed in the UK. But for me, I think the literary dimension of sports writing is something which is different from country to country, and I think in the United Kingdom, at least, I think there's a recognition now that there has been some fantastic writing. Regardless of what sport it's about, indeed that it's about sport at all, there's some fantastic writing written by people who happen to be sports writers, and acknowledging that and trying to understand the just what sports writing is capable of achieving is something that clearly there's some interest in now from publishers, which is fantastic for somebody like me who is both somebody who likes to write about sport and write academically. I think Rodney, you're on mute.
Oh,
There
rookie
we go.
error. Sorry, I was going to invite our other panelists to elaborate on that, perhaps with a few personal insights, whence their personal interest in this field.
I think Tom has just really laid out a really beautiful and robust sort of history of this approach to sports journalism, and sort of the literary history there that I think we still struggle with a little bit. I think in modern journalism to defend the literary aspects of sports journalism, and why we should go about telling a story a particular way that falls outside of what I think in Australian sports media is probably quite similar to what we might see in British sports media as well, that there are a lot of formats and constraints and styles that we're really used to tell a certain sporting story in a certain way. And I guess what I found really interesting, Rodney, to your question around this, revitalization or growth of literary sports journalism in the last few years, is this space that I occupy, which is mostly around the coverage of women's sports. I've seen really challenge some of the styles of sports journalism or come at sports reporting in a really different and diverse way. And that's mostly because the storytellers coming into that space often haven't had that traditional journalism training, haven't come from a sporting background. They've come from other types of storytelling, and their interest into the sporting space is coming through different entry points that has driven their interest. So they're interested in aspects that maybe more traditional sports fans have not really focused on, and they're sort of drawing out stories in really interesting ways. And I noticed that a lot in my classroom. I've developed a sports media course at Deakin University here in Melbourne, Australia, and I have students coming in to take that as an elective who are not particularly sports fans, but they get really scared the first few weeks because they don't know how to write a match report. They might not know something about a particular sport and the style that they need to write in. And I kind of throw the question back at them and think, well, what do you think sports writing is? And they will say, oh, well, it's interviewing a player and it's writing a report about the game, or doing some pre-match analysis. And I think, well, yeah, okay, but what else? What else can you do? And I give them all these examples, some of the ones that Tom has highlighted in his book, and some of the great sports journalists that we highlight in our book as well. And it just really challenges them to think that, well, we don't have to have this very rigid definition of what sports journalism is, and we can intersect it with these other ways of storytelling, particularly right now. I know we'll talk about this a little bit later about sort of diversification of media and how AI comes into this space, and sort of the perceived threat of journalism and how tough the industry is. But there are also a lot of opportunities through new media to tell stories in different ways. And literary sports journalism for me is playing a really strong role in amplifying a lot of sports stories that we might not have seen before. This space kind of exploded a little bit with assistance from the internet age, new media, and alternative media platforms. So to me, that's really exciting. But I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about some of the concerns we might have about that space too.
Thank you. And Prof. Ellison, you've been very patient.
Oh, not at all. Thank you. Thanks very much. Um, a good evening here. I'm in Adelaide and with a sleeping toddler who hopefully will stay sleeping through this session. So at any point, if you see me vanish, you will know why. I thought maybe I'll just add a little bit because in some ways I feel a tiny bit like an interloper. I have come to writing about sports a bit later on in my academic career, I suppose. And I thought I might just share briefly. I sort of came to this because I particularly was interested in popular culture, but also in things like how we represent our sort of national identities in writing. And so I started off doing a lot of work about the Australian beach. I used to live on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, lovely place to be. Spent a lot of time at the beach. So anyway, I was really interested in how the stories that we tell about ourselves and landscapes can reveal a lot about who we are. And that sort of led me to working with one of our colleagues, Lee McGowan, who is the lead author of contemporary literary sports journalism. So we ended up writing about beach soccer, as you do. And so that was my first foray into really thinking about sports writing. And obviously my particular interest was in how the spaces that the sport takes place and you know, the way that we think about that and sort of contextualize that and even conceptualize it, tell us something interesting about the sport, but also the people playing it, the countries playing it, and some of those sort of identity questions. And so then, of course, I was really interested to collaborate and be part of this book, which is when I jumped into really what was just my hobby of loving cricket, being a cricket tragic, and just thought, right, I'm going to do that thing we always say we shouldn't do, which is, you know, put together our work and our pleasure. So so for me, it was a really interesting process of actually having to, I suppose, you know, take some time to delve into these texts that I'd read for fun, you know, and that I just enjoyed, and started to really think about them from a literary perspective, and again thinking about what it tells us about ourselves and what it can represent about particularly the countries. I think that, you know, obviously can lend itself, sports writing can really lend itself to quite sort of nationalistic kind of writing and thinking. And maybe just the only other kind of point I might add on this idea of the rise of literary journalism is, you know, maybe it's not a coincidence that a lot of this academic interest is coming at a time when we might say that there's some real challenges in the institutions writing about sports and, you know, the shifting landscape. And, you know, I think that can be a classic thing for academics, that we try and archive and capture and, you know, make sure that we're telling a story and capturing those moments so that they're not lost as the landscape so drastically shifts.
Now, not all sports journalism obviously is literary. There are some very large obstacles in the way of any sports writer with literary pretensions or ambitions, not least among them the conformity imposed by house styles and the stresses of super short deadlines. How does a writer, and how have writers, balanced these challenges with the sort of reflective and interpretive qualities required for literary writing?
Well, I'm still a practicing sports writer, and I do often write on very, very tight deadlines. And the challenge for me, as it is for other sports journalists with a modicum of literary ambition, is to how to meet deadlines while still hopefully writing something that has, if not enduring value, then at least more than just a momentary existence. So, speaking personally, this might be of interest. I mean, I as paradoxical as it might sound, if I know I'm doing a fairly extensive match report and it needs to be sent, you know, 5 minutes after the final whistle to the Times sports desk, I will actually, you know, the day before the game or the afternoon leading up to the evening kickoff, I will start to craft what might end up being my midsection to the piece. Maybe there's a particular individual player that, almost come what may in the game, I know that this bit about this player is going to be sort of relevant or can be woven into the piece. Or maybe there's something that's happened away from the on-field action, even something, you know, from another field of human life. Maybe there's a political event occurring which the game somehow kind of is connected to, and I can start to draw these connections, and I can start to think about the game even before it's begun. I can start to maybe come up with a perspective which I can then sketch out and begin to elaborate on in a literary but hopefully unpretentious way. So yeah, I mean, the time pressures can be acute, and I think, you know, I've sat alongside brilliant writers who can turn up, you know, not even open their laptop until half an hour into a you know, an 80-minute rugby match, and then on the final whistle, you know, they've produced 600, 700 words that, you know, which I read the next day or read online that later that evening, and it's almost like a piece of alchemy that it's happened. And that's quite something to witness. And I remember when I first became a sports writer, I remember because I was a news reporter by trade, and I became a sports writer almost by accident. And I remember, yeah, Elizabeth mentioned there about having to be wary about merging your professional activities with your personal passions. And for a long time, I'd avoided sort of going anywhere near rugby in particular, which is my sport journalistically, because I wanted to keep it in that sort of compartmentalized space away from work. But in the end, the two did come together. But I remember then immersing myself in what other sports writers covering rugby were doing, and trying to pick out their ticks, their stylistic approaches, and seeing as we're having conversations about literary sports journalism, there's a theory around intertextuality in literary studies about how texts build and breed upon texts, and we as writers, we consciously or not, we're absorbing what we read, and we're building on that, and devising it sometimes to our own purposes. And I remember that was a way in which my own, of course, I came at it with my own perspective. I did philosophy as an undergraduate. I've always been a keen philosopher, but I wanted to also then look at what other writers were doing, and sort of marinate in that for a little while. So sorry, I've sort of gone off on a slight sort of personal odyssey there, and I haven't really addressed the issue of technology constraints, but maybe one of my panelists can do that.
I was actually really interested, Tom, to hear your own personal experiences of it. And I suppose the chapters that I was writing in our book were mostly about cricket, and so of course there's some really interesting ways of thinking about those time constraints. I even sort of had to remind myself what I'd written, to be honest, but you could really break it down to which I'm sure will be familiar to just about everyone on the screen. The idea of there's over by over coverage, there's the wrap of the day's play, a longer reflective piece at the end of the game. This is obviously thinking about Test cricket, and then usually some sort of series wrap as well. So you've got these sort of micro through to macro opportunities, and so thinking through the experience of the journalists on one day of play versus the five, and then say a 5-test series. It's quite an interesting, I'm sure we've all seen it, where you see the narrative build through the series, assuming the series might be live for all 5 tests. But I guess maybe the only other comment I just sort of add there as well that I thought I often was curious, and having certainly never experienced it myself, and Tom and Kasey, perhaps you have, and could speak to it as well, is just the idea of what happens when you're moving in a bit of a media pack. Because I get the impression that certainly cricket, it can really be a sport where we see people and journalists working together in a bit of a media pack, and the experience of that seems to be quite, well, perhaps it's going away a little bit, but it certainly seems to bring with it a certain sort of sensibility and a sort of technique, and really adds to the experience, I suppose, of the writing. And then as the reader as well, we get to follow along this story. For instance, I quite enjoyed reading, Jeff Lemon, Steve Smith Men, quite a fascinating book. And he does talk specifically, for those of you who've read it, he talks about the experience of being part of the media pack when Australia toured to South Africa and the infamous Test, and actually, what it was like to be doing all of these live crosses from a cupboard in a hotel, and having to really set up. That in itself became kind of part of the story, which was quite fascinating as well. So little question there for you both, Tom and Kasey, if you have anything in particular from your experiences about that too.
Yeah, I definitely do. The media pack is interesting. I think I could tell some war stories, but maybe they might be for another time. But what I will draw from that, which I think kind of links into what I was going to say about this idea of how we can, still really create like deep, nuanced, beautiful literary sports journalism with the constraints of modern media, deadlines, and sort of fighting for short attention spans and clicks that all of us are kind of up against in the journalism space. And I'm still practicing a little bit, definitely not as much as what Tom is, but I guess my experience came from the idea of I was really I felt really excluded from the media pack. My background is mostly in Australian rules football journalism. And, it's a cliche, but like it was a boys' club, and it was very difficult to find women in press conferences, and when you did, we were all under our own pressures, so we didn't really connect, and we kind of tried to hang around and form those relationships. And there was definitely some men who were journalists of that time who were wonderful and supportive. But you could see that pack happening, and that sensibility that you talk about, Liz, of people collaborating and sharing and trying to get like I was at this end of the ground for this play, you were at the other side, like what did you see, let's compare notes, did you get this quote, did you speak to this coach? That was all happening, and I could see it, but I wasn't part of it. So I found that really interesting experience, and that's probably why I've gone a little bit more into academia, is to sort of understand those dynamics a little bit more. But it also made me more motivated to get into the women's sports space, because the media pack essentially in women's sports is a very different experience, and I felt very embraced and supported in that space. And that really taught me, because similar to your story, Liz, my background is not through, I'm not a traditionally trained journalist. I came from more so the corporate side of sport, working in marketing and corporate communications, and then transitioned into journalism and storytelling. And I didn't really understand all these tools that you needed as a journalist, particularly in modern media. And it was through that kind of little pack that we created following the start of the AFL women's competition here in Australia, which is started in 2017, Aussie Rules for Women in a National Comp. And we started talking about this idea of being a multi-skilled journalist. And that's just like, you not just writing a match report once a week anymore, like you need to be doing more. And this idea of, well, if you're going into a press conference and you're interviewing a coach or interviewing a player, most of the time you're going to have so much more content than what actually ends up in your match report. If you're doing a pre-match interview with a player, like you're going to have so much more than goes into your quick little spin for your preview. I was doing interviews mostly throughout the week with a lot of athletes about their story, how they got into the sport, and would end up with just so much more than what my editor wanted in a 700-word digital article. So we would talk about these ideas. Well, how do we multi-purpose content? Let's put this out in podcasts. Let's create our own newsletters through Substack, create our own blogs and website, and play with the form a little bit there if we are up against these deadlines and time constraints. And I think in the Australian modern women's sports media space, there are some really great examples of deep, nuanced literary sports journalism that has come out of necessity of trying to do something different, but still playing the game a little bit to get those match reports in, fulfill the editor's requirements, but take all that other stuff that you already have and recraft it, reach new audiences, and build up a profile for yourself as a journalist that then comes back into this cycle where you do become a bit known for that. And I've seen journalists really succeed in that space where then, well, their editors start paying attention to them because they're getting great response for their stuff they're putting out on independent channels. And the editor wants that audience back on the mainstream platform, so brings them in that way. So I think you have to be really crafty and work really hard in this space to do it. But there are ways around it, and I think there are some really clever journalists out there who have figured out ways to disseminate their storytelling different platforms in different ways.
Would it be fair to describe the genre of literary sports journalism as largely a 20th century phenomenon? It certainly seems to be in our domain, in the domain of cricket. We've a number of experienced scholars of the game in our audience who all know just how jarringly different was the Victorian mode of sports reportage to what we're familiar with today. Very few exceptions. I'd probably shout out the Melbourne Argus account of the inaugural Test match, whose author I was delighted recently to identify. What you would get back then would be an almost over by over notation of the play, essentially a scorecard in prose. The change when it comes, at least in cricket, is dramatic, and it coincides, to my eyes, almost precisely with the rise of a certain Manchester Guardian writer. I wonder if Tom would like to say a bit about him and his legacy.
I think you touched on something really interesting there, and I talk about it a bit in one of my chapters in the book, about the tension between, and this hopefully will be relevant to the audience today, between statistical, numerical recording of events, which of course have their place in sport. Score lines generally are important, but there's a seam in sports writing, of course, which is more geared towards the human individuals the psychology of those human individuals that ultimately underpins the statistics that arise from the fixture. And I think, today we have that tension as well. We talk about data journalism, data-driven journalism. Of course, we've got far more data than we've ever had before, thanks to technology, far more data than we actually need. And being able to see the wood for the trees and being able to know which statistics are really useful to weave into a story and which is just maybe unnecessary detail is an important question for journalists today. But going back to, as you say, that sort of late Victorian, Edwardian, early 20th century pivot where sort of Neville Cardus almost doesn't just make it acceptable, he sort of changes the requirements, I suppose, for what it means to successfully record a game. And as what his biographer put it, that he made cricket writing or sports writing a job for artists as well as artisans. This idea that it becomes not just as you're describing, Rodney, a sort of methodical recording of overs and facts with a bit of crafting involved, but actually it becomes more of an artistic endeavour in and of itself. And as you say, Cardus wouldn't see a distinction between writing a review of the Halle Orchestra's performance that evening in Manchester, because he was a classical music critic as well as a cricket writer. He wouldn't see a difference between bringing that element of critique to a piece of opera or classical music, and then writing a similar length piece about a test match. He would require adopt the same kind of critical stance. And I suppose he was that a legacy of the sort of Victorian tradition of the gentleman's style is not quite right, but the idea of bringing taste and a sort of an era of amateur era sort of love of the musical, love of the sport, but then interrogating that in a way that also began to, as I say, rather than just recording incidents, would record the kind of motivations and some of the deeper issues that play under the surface. And if I may, but just a quick reversion back to the previous question, I think in terms of some of the best cricket writing for me has been done by people who were able to free themselves or who've been able to be unfettered by the restrictions of having to deal with press conferences and going through traditional routes. Instead, they've been able to build relationships, often quite, friendships, one-to-one connections with cricketers, and then build almost pen portraits, profile pieces based on that. David Foote, who was I'm down in Gloucestershire in England, and David Foote was a cricket writer some of you will know for the Guardian, based down in the West Country here, and he wrote. They've been collected in a couple of volumes. Wrote some brilliant sort of portraits of cricketers, but interestingly, much of it hinges on less. Doesn't dwell on what they were doing on the pitch so much as on the field, so much as kind of reflecting on some of the other seams, emotional seams in their lives, and how they then interwove with their lives as cricketers, and it creates these kind of detailed pictures of them. So, but I think relating it back to the question, I think Neville Cardus probably opened the door to people like David Foote then being able to take ultimately cricket writing and sports writing down that more discursive route.
And was cricket slow to the party? Did Neville Cardus serve as a sort of catalyst for a catch-up, or was he a landmark in literary sports journalism writ large?
I think he did change attitudes more generally towards sports writing, but then I think at that point, to go back to Elizabeth's point about the mechanics of a day's play, or even a series, and how the flow of copy from a journalist sort of changes in the course of a day. Back at that time, of course, there wasn't the pressure. Neville Cardus was never told that he needed to live tweet a county match or a test match. That he'd be able to take his time in the course of a day, and allow the creative juices to start to sort of flow over lunch, and sort of ponder things a little bit more, and there'd be that greater time for reflection before the writing began. And in that extent, the medium is the message. The medium that we're writing for does determine, to a certain extent, the output that we're able to produce. And I think Cardus had that opportunity then. The format of cricket itself, as well as the print media deadlines of the day, and more generous deadlines than we have now, enabled him and others to be able to do this more strand of what one colleague of mine has called leafy lane journalism, this more sort of weaving, rambling, glorious wander, rather than being sort of constantly sort of trying to hit a social media sort of driven deadline. But I think on that point of trailblazing pieces, it was probably about 1820 when William Hazlitt, who was an accomplished writer in many fields, he wrote a piece called The Fight, which became, historians now of sports writing probably regard that in some senses as the first piece of recognizable sort of sports feature or sports writing. It's an account of people making their way from London out towards a location in the home counties for a bare knuckle fight, and it's as much about the people travelling to this bout as it is about the fighting itself. So it's a bit like Cardus. It's trying to conjure up a wider setting and a more reflective approach to the event than just the obvious blows or deliveries or boundaries or whatever it might be.
I suppose at this point I'd invite some questions from the audience. Please don't be shy.
Yes, thank you. It's been interesting. Just following up what Tom was saying and some of the comments earlier, I wondered about the panel's view about why it is, or if or why it is, that some sports may lend themselves more to literary journalism than others, and if so, what actually is that about? Is it about the history or the nature of the sport itself? Is it about the journalist's interest or the media that they're writing for? Is it about the audience? And I'm particularly picking up on the Australian end about in sports mad country, several different sports people are very involved and keen to hear about. And is the same literary aspect within that country with the different sports in the different parts of the country?
Maybe I'll just make a couple of thoughts and then I'm sure pass on. But I think that's a really a good question around the different types of sports and which ones lend themselves a little bit more to that idea of something more literary. And it's probably it's an easy thing to consider. It's about the amount of sport there is, as in cricket, for instance, I think does lend itself because of the length of time and the way that a narrative can build over such a long stage. But it also, I think, this might be a little bit simplistic, but I think often for me, some of the elements of literary journalism in sports really comes down to, place, players and people, so when there's a really interesting kind of element to the place where something is taking, is occurring, the players, but even then just sort of like, I suppose, the people within that as well. So we do a bit like what Tom was mentioning, that, some of the best cricket writing, contemporary cricket writing, is those very people, player driven stories that come through. But we're exposed to a lot of people in long form games. I suppose it's not particularly eloquent, but I think there's certainly in Australia, I think some of the contemporary sports writing does probably, like much around the world, fall into that trap sometimes of getting quite focused on the people and the personalities within it. But the literary journalism that perhaps feels the most successful, at least to me, is the work that can go a little bit deeper than that, a little bit beyond just the superficial sort of personality piece, but thinking about maybe that, that place or the sort of position of that sport. a little bit more holistically as well. Kasey, you've probably got some more you could add to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I did a study quite a few years ago now as part of my PhD, just trying to understand from an Australian point of view what our literary landscape was like when it came to sport. And it's so fascinating that really sport literature is really underrepresented in Australia for a, like you said, a nation that is so obsessed with sport. We have some amazing literary sports journalists, of course, and some great storytelling over time, and that has lent itself to particular sports, with cricket, Australian rules football, rugby league being the three main ones. But I don't know. I feel like there is this, hesitation in Australian culture to really go, to quote unquote highbrow or too literary. In the past, we have a bit of a cringe factor with this type of storytelling, which I think has limited a lot of writers, or kept a lot of writers in the sidelines. And now we're sort of combating that a little bit with a shift in culture. Like we mentioned before, how like in the States, literary sports journalism and sort of this different type of storytelling is a lot more prevalent there, and they have this sort of different approach to this sense of grandeur and navel gazing that allows for these stories. But I think in Australian culture, we don't really like that so much. We sort of shoot those things down quite a bit, which has limited our storytelling. And I feel, we've missed a lot of stories because of that. So I think now our culture is shifting a little bit and allowing for some more of that diverse storytelling coming through. I think what Tom said before was really interesting about this idea of medium. And I've always been reflecting since we wrote this book about, well, what is literary sports journalism in our current landscape, when literary analogies are a very different thing to what we were looking at sort of in the 20th century. And I think there's some really great like literary sports journalism happening, in places like the live blogs of newspapers, on places like Twitter, maybe a few years ago before Twitter changed and, we really lost a lot of great content there. But the sports that aren't as represented, I think, in Australia, are finding their places there. Like there are amazing netball bloggers that exist out there who are telling incredible stories about netball, which I think has been completely overlooked in literary sports journalism and broader storytelling about sport. Women's T20 cricket has an incredible Twitter page called Australian Women's Cricket Without Context that does live tweets from all the matches, and I think there's literary beauty in those tweets that should be collated and maybe put into a book. But maybe that's not the point. It has to exist in the medium that it presents. But yeah, I think there's definitely sports that have been more covered traditionally in literary sports journalism. But I think Australia is a very interesting case study there. But Tom, I don't know if you have any further reflections on what sports maybe in the UK are a bit different from what we experience here.
Well, I certainly think that cricket is a sport which, going back to Neville Cardus, is a sport which has lent itself to more literary output because of the direction that Cardus and other writers around his time or just after him, due to the direction that they put cricket writing on. So I think if you look at Cardus's writings and his own sort of reflections, later on in his career, and also if you look at the writings of CLR James, who for 3 seasons was Cardus's assistant, got his break really through Cardus's patronage. Those two are pivotal writers in the history of cricket writing and sports writing more generally. And it's no coincidence that they both regarded cricket itself as an aesthetic activity as well as a sporting one. James's vocabulary around describing cricket, it often uses the kind of vocabulary that an art critic might use. He talks about the significant form of a batsman. He talks about the constraints of a bowling action, having to have the arm straight, but using that constraint to make something beautiful within that restriction. And there's one quote from Cardus where he says, to look up at the scoreboard when a certain batsman is in full flight would be as disrespectful as to look at a score of the Eroica Symphony whilst it's being performed in front of you. The idea that the scoring of the runs is sort of irrelevant. Actually, we're looking at the beauty of the execution of the style of the stylists in front of us. So there was a sense in which, just as there could be art for art's sake, there could be sort of cricketing technique for cricketing technique's sake, and there was Cardus saw a parallel between the two, and almost did make a case for cricket being art, just as CLR James argued that cricket provided a type of aesthetic beauty. So therefore, if your key writers in the history of that sport are very preoccupied with the idea of the sport itself being an aesthetic, beautiful activity, their writing, their literary contribution then tries to capture that elegance and that beauty, and therefore is self-consciously literary. So I think that's why cricket writing does, not universally, but certainly there is a strong tradition of cricket writing which maybe does adopt that more self-consciously literary heritage and approach. Even though, and I absolutely agree here with Kasey, that in certain countries there still remains a sort of almost embarrassed or awkwardness around the idea of pursuing that sort of literary approach, an awkwardness that has never existed hasn't been there in the United States, where baseball writers in particular were given free rein to approach the topic in as high-minded, highbrow literary way as they wanted for many decades. And that's because in American culture, I think you have novelists as well. Some of the leading novelists of the 20th century in the United States could turn their hand, more than turn their hand. They would also write about sport in a way which didn't seem like it was an abrupt gear shift. John Updike, wrote a brilliant piece about baseball, more than one brilliant piece about baseball, alongside all his novels, and that was kind of one example of how there's a sort of seamless movement between fiction and sports writing in the United States, which I think probably hasn't existed in the UK and probably not in Australia, but I'm not qualified to talk on that.
Norman Mailer too, probably a great boxing writer, and by all accounts, a pretty aggressive boxer himself. Jeremy, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Rodney, and thanks to the to the speakers. It's been very provocative. I don't know whether they're not sure whether this is a question, but it's just reflections really based on some things that I've been sort of digging out in research I've been doing. We mentioned Cardus, and I think the whole sort of interwar period around cricket reporting is really interesting. As a sort of after the First World War, sort of explosion in the popular press, and just more space and more pictures and so on. And I was just interested, thinking that there's more weekly magazines, which provides more space for long form writing. And I'm thinking, for example, the Illustrated Sports and Dramatic News newspaper. I mean, if you look in there, there's quite a lot of well-known literary people. I'm thinking of articles, for example, by A.A. Milne, Hugh Walpole, novelist, Edmund Blunden, as well. So I think there's something about. I mean, we talked about technology. I suppose there's something about the technology of the 20s and 30s and the sort of changing nature of media in that period, which provides opportunities for more long form reporting by a lot of good writers about, and they could then write about cricket and indeed other sports. And in fact, I mean, it could well be that sort of magazine, for example, really systematically working through there would raise quite a lot of interesting issues. I mean, the game was very, very, very popular in the 1920s and 30s, and including particularly amongst a lot of well-educated middle class people. There's quite a lot of crossover as well between literary world, the theatre world, and cricket. People like Gerald du Maurier was a big was a theatre impresario, an actor of the 20s, was a big cricketer, very keen on cricket. and so on. So I think there's and people like Hugh Walpole. I mean, they write about personality of cricketers. Walpole was obsessed with Patsy Hendren, and so there's some interesting articles that people like he have written. So I think I think the interwar period is really interesting, and I wonder whether in fact it's sort of a bit of a golden age for literate sports reporting. And in fact, in the course of some research I did notice that A.A. Milne, for example, did cricket reporting for the News Chronicle at times, and also R.C. Sheriff, the playwright. He was another one who was, involved in writing some cricket reporting in the 30s. So I think it's beyond just Cardus. I think there's a whole series of people who are perhaps less well known, and certainly they weren't necessarily writers that I was aware of, most of them, apart from A.A. Milne, obviously. But they were interested in cricket and the technology of the day, and the expansion of popular press and these weekly magazines, I think, gave them the opportunity to write more reflectively about cricket.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I probably ought to mine your brain for a bit more of that research. It sounds really interesting. That as you say that. I mean, I wasn't aware of some of the Hugh Walpole, for example. I'll certainly try and dig out some of those writings. As you've identified, that was a bit of a turning point. Just as there've been other decades as well, where I think, as you say, the way in which certain magazines, with their larger sort of space, their bigger canvas, have sparked a fresh energy around sports writing. And in the United States, the mid-late 60s, Esquire magazine there, would give writers, Tom Wolfe, Hunter S. Thompson, Gay Talese, they would give these writers a couple of months to work on a big profile piece. Gay Talese going off trying to get an interview with Joe DiMaggio as DiMaggio's reaching the end of his life, and there's a famous long multi-thousand word piece that Gay Talese, the American sports writer, wrote about the fading powers of Joe DiMaggio. Never actually got a proper interview with DiMaggio, but still writes this magnificent piece which is more about a sort of human character as it is about a baseball player. But again, to reinforce your point, I think at that point, American society, an increasingly affluent society, a bit of time on their hands due to sort of convenience, technologies emerging. They had time to read in the 1960s, and there was a bit of a heyday then of magazine writing, and that then enabled this sports writing to flourish. So I think there are, you were suggesting there that a certain kind of educated, middle class, post-war period, there are certain conditions which maybe then lend themselves to these things flourishing. And you can see these other periods maybe in other countries also following a similar pattern.
I think the fact that the reality is, in the 20s and 30s, cricket was probably as popular as it has ever been in England, and cricketers were probably as high profile as they've ever been. And therefore, I guess, from the point of view of people wanting to sell newspapers and people wanting to sell magazines, writing more reflectively about cricketers and other sports people, just made business sense as much as anything else. And there were quite clearly there was a pool of literate people who were more than happy to write about something which was probably an obsession since childhood. So in a sense, it's probably not surprising. There was the sort of supply and demand during this period, and then I guess with the decline in interest in cricket in this country post Second World War, there would just be less reason for giving over more and more space to the subject. Just a thought. Those are just reflections based on some things I've been reading.
Thank you all very much so far. What I'm going to say is just slightly amended because of the contribution of Jeremy, really. I've just finished a book which is not going to have a major attraction for anybody, really, but it's about cricket in Portsmouth in 1926. So I'm kind of picking up precisely the period. And the reason it's cricket in Portsmouth in 1926 is that we happen to be celebrating the centenary of Portsmouth becoming a city. And that many of you will have seen, even probably down under, will have seen that the city of Portsmouth has been in the news quite a lot in the last week or two about ships not leaving the harbour and then leaving it. And we became a city principally because we were being recognised as the heart of the Navy and the British Empire. But my writing about it, while it does include, for example, 4 county championship matches, which I can read about in Wisden and in the Cricketer and do that kind of archival research. The point I wanted to offer really was about the notion that Tom's raised of intertextuality. The idea that we can go to sports journalism, which in my case recently has been 100 years old, and rework it so that it becomes an intertextual piece of writing. And I guess in some ways the most interesting stuff that I've been writing about isn't, well, it certainly isn't the county cricket, which is well enough recorded and everybody can find out about. It's actually about the Dockyard League Division 3 when the shipwrights play the electricians on a Saturday afternoon, and there's a whole league, which in itself raises all sorts of questions about assumptions about league cricket. There's lots of writing you can read around league cricket, which suggests that none of it ever came south of Blackpool or somewhere. It was completely untrue. In Portsmouth, we had a Dockyard League, we had a Portsmouth Cricket League, and we even had an elementary schools league with 3 divisions in it, which produced at least 1 county cricketer. So that in itself is interesting. But of course, the point really that I wanted to make is that writing that I'm going to the archives for is not, in a sense, literary at all. So the intertextual thing for me, and I guess it's not a question really, I'm just making an observation. The intertextual thing for me is about whether you can resurrect cricket journalism that isn't essentially that literary, but actually produce out of it something that is more literary.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Liz, you jump in. I was just
No,
going to
no, no.
maybe mention Marion Stell there. I don't know if that's where you were going.
Jump in, Kasey, for sure.
Yeah, Dave, I think that's such an important point, and I think I almost think that's not the responsibility of historians to do, but maybe the responsibility of historians to lead with some of those ideas and projects to journalists or writers or bring those gems to the fore. And the example we have here in Australia, some of you might be aware of Professor Marion Stell, one of our greatest sports historians here in Australia. She's written extensively on women's football, but also women's cricket. And her book, The Bodyline Fix, I feel like I have it right here on my desk. I've got to show it. It's just so good. Do I have it here? No, maybe it's on my desk in my office. I'll send a link, but yeah, The Bodyline Fix is sort of the story of the Australian England women's test, and she's told that story. It's a historical book, but she's gone back through texts like you've been looking at, and she's drawn that together in a literary way to tell this incredible story. Oh, actually, it's here down here. I moved it. This one, The Bodyline Fix by Marion
It got a
Stell.
very positive review in the pages of our journal not long ago.
Yes, fantastic, isn't it? But yeah, I think Marion is one of the very few people here in Australia, and I know cricket writers like Ralph Nicholson as well in the UK does a similar thing, where they've got this capacity as historians to do this work and find these stories and also translate them into something that is a literary story that might be more accessible or compelling, that draws these stories out of the history books into something else. But they can only do so much by themselves. So I sort of hope that we can particularly from an Australian point of view, that we can connect with more historians here to understand where these stories are and bring some more journalists and storytellers in to understand that some of these stories have already happened and need a wider audience and need that literary journalism touch. It's not just about finding the stories that are currently happening on the field. There's some great stuff in the archives. Liz, I'll get back over to you.
Thanks, Kasey. And in many ways, I think you've captured exactly what I was thinking. It's just the ability of the sort of literary techniques, and the if you like, the slower paced capturing of that history really lends itself, doesn't it? And I mean, Gideon Haigh is probably a good Australian example, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of his work. Some of it's, really time specific, and then others quite historical and telling those bigger stories, but also maybe just reflecting that that's a real opportunity, I think, to tell some of the stories that haven't had a lot of airtime. It's obviously, cricket writing has generally tended to be more white and male dominated than it is as a sport. So, unearthing the ability to unearth some of those different stories through exactly that type of archival work, and finding these little gems of interest that can be told and taken to a wider audience. It's really powerful.
We did spotlight earlier the question of AI, and I think having discussed so much of the history of literary sports journalism, it's worth taking a peek into the future. So what about AI? What about its intervention, or as I tend to think of it, intrusion? The implications seem pretty profound, and from a literary or aesthetic or artistic point of view, I'd submit they're profoundly disturbing. Is the panel as pessimistic as I am? Is literary journalism becoming enshittified?
Maybe I'll jump first, and then throw to Tom and Kasey. But I suppose for me, I think of course there's real risk. I think genuine risk for all, for all writing, and certainly just while we learn and understand exactly how it works, and where the limitations are, and so on. But I suppose in the work that we did, and a lot of what we were, particularly the cricket work that I was doing, what struck me is that so much of it is about who is doing the writing. It's really about who is speaking, not just what is said. And so I think that, and there's a real, I feel, and particularly in the contemporary work, but also historical, there's a real sense now of finding authenticity. And the rise of new media really lends itself to this. Of course, it's spoken word, it's dialogue, it's constant content all the time. So of course there's a risk that AI, we lean on it because of that need for content. But there's a real authenticity of voice that seems to be a big driver of what it is that we consume and what we want in our sports, particularly our literary journalism. I think there's the reason why particular voices continue, Barney Ronay and Jeff Lemon, and there's a real particular way to their writing, but that's so infused by them and their voice. And so I don't think, even with use of AI, I don't think that would be completely lost. But that's my kind of initial thoughts, and I'm willing to be argued against.
Rodney, I have to be optimistic. Otherwise, I will just, I have to find something to keep working in this space for, because otherwise I'll just give up. I am worried, but I'm trying to think about it more positively, in the sense that exactly what Liz just said. I think most audiences are pretty discerning about what they're reading, and they're making, more individual choices more than ever about what they're reading, about their favorite sports. So whether that's going to their favorite journalists or storytellers, their favorite outlets, they are driven by authenticity, and we can usually tell when something is pretty stock standard. With that said, I see some opportunities with some journalists that I'm working with right now who are trialing AI for certain type of things that they're working on. They're trying to do it in a way where they're taking more of that formulaic sports reporting to alleviate some of their workloads. And I have to be optimistic that this is the way it will go. I can definitely see some ways that this might be misused or taken to another level. But the journalists that I'm working with are taking, we were talking about the high pressure of trying to file match reports at the end of your day's play and to get things to deadline. They're taking things like stat sheets and maybe some things that they've worked on pre-game and putting it into AI to generate just a match report that just has bare minimum, like no analysis, nothing that is really understanding the nuance of the game, but it's just giving the scores, highlights, just putting something in an easy to read template that fans might want to quickly look at just to understand some top level information. But it is freeing them up a little bit to spend a bit more time doing a deeper dive on the analysis, spending a few more hours writing something that is, you know, a bit more robust, and is writing that they enjoy as well. Tom, you might be different because it sounds like you have a really nice approach to your match reports. It sounds quite lovely how you prepare them. But some of the the journalists I work with, you know, the match report is the bane of their existence. You know, they want to write those feature pieces, those profiles, but match reports are what people are clicking on after the game. So the editors want them up fast because they know where the traffic is going to be. So I see some advantages of AI there to help with the workload a little bit of journalists, and I have to be optimistic that I see it as a tool for that and that it's not going to go too awry. But I have seen examples where, you know, because that tool is there, some sports are sort of being fed into that area. Well, like and I guess it's mostly women's sports that this is happening to, that, well, we're not dedicating your full team to follow that beat, or we don't have people to follow every women's sport, so we'll just get the stat sheet and feed it through AI to say that we're quote unquote covering that women's sport. And for example, in Australian press, I've seen match reports from women's rugby league matches go to press with no sub editing, where, you know, the AI prompts are still in the piece and it's gone to publication. So that is the danger with things like this, if they get offloaded and we think AI is going to do everything. But I think that also proves that, well, AI can't do everything, can only do a limited amount of things. I've seen journalists take transcripts from interviews of coaches who lost a match and said something like, well, we had a terrible game, didn't we? And then that has been phrased through AI. It's like, they had it. No, we had a fantastic game, didn't we? Sorry, I missed the analogy there. Because of the sarcasm, so it's like, oh, well, we had a fantastic game, didn't we? And they actually lost. And the AI puts that into like, this team had an amazing game, blah, 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 because it can't understand sarcasm or any sort of tone. So AI can't do everything. We still need human voice. And I think we connect with human voice at a fundamental level. And I don't think it's going to change our storytelling too much. And that is what I have to believe to get me out of bed every day, to know that AI isn't going to ruin our beautiful sports reporting. But yeah, like Liz said, we'll wait and see till we understand it a bit more. But right now, I'm not too pessimistic. I'm trying to be more optimistic.
Tom, perhaps you'd like the last word.
Oh gosh, well, it's a massive question, and I think the issue around AI and the prevalence of AI more generally in terms of media content and journalistic content is inseparable from the extent to which I can get slightly political here, the extent to which regulators and governments make an effort to arrest the decline of attention spans of young people. Because I know Australia obviously have taken a widely documented approach towards social media. Other nations are looking at it too, but while we have a withering attention span and a willingness just to sort of scroll an endless tide of social media slop, then if that unthinking consuming of that material with short attention spans goes unarrested, then I think, you know, AI could become a means of delivering that kind of bland content or dangerous content. So I think there's something to be done around media literacy in the broader sense. You know, and you know, we not just as journalists, obviously we want an audience that's going to have the ability to read beyond our first few words or listen to us beyond the first few words that they hear. You know, but more generally for society, we need to have a citizenry, a populace which is able to focus and tune in. So I think AI and that issue are intertwined. I think literary sports writing ultimately is about capturing the soul of a sport, and it's about capturing the souls of the individuals playing that sport. And as sort of Dave said earlier, you know, you can then return as a writer to those events, and as a writer, you can apply a fresh gloss of meaning or reinterpretation to that, a fresh element of soul, if you will. So for me, a world stripped of content that is produced by humans is one where the soul is systematically kind of removed from it. And if you remove the element of soul from those things which bestow meaning on human life, and I'm talking here about play, sport, music, if those things which are manifestations of the human spirit become devoid of human spirit, then things become a wasteland more generally. So this is an area where, like Kasey suggests there, we need to believe this, and we need to sort of not just believe it, but sort of fight the cause to ensure that words continue to hold the meaning that they can have. Because if we just subcontract meaning to something which is inherently lacking in consciousness and doesn't know what those symbols denote, then we're just giving up on constructing meaning more generally. So a bit of a philosophical point at the end, but also a kind of a call to action for writers to continue to write, because we do, in the act of writing and reinterpreting and creating meaning, we do bestow meaning upon the world and the games that we love.
Art, if nothing else, is people making stuff. Without the people and the making, it's just stuff. On that note, thanks everyone. This has been great. See you all again soon. Have a lovely day and a lovely sleep, those of you in Australia. Bye bye.